Get out. You don't live here anymore, Silas spat, his finger jabbing toward the heavy oak front door as if he were commanding a disobedient dog. I looked at the coffee mug in my hand, watching the dark liquid ripple, and realized my hands were shaking, not from age, but from a cold, sharp rage. Martha sat across from me, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief as she processed the venom in our son-in-law's voice. We had given him everything, opened our lives to him, and this was the thanks we received on a quiet Tuesday morning. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. I set the mug down slowly, the ceramic clicking against the granite countertop I had paid for myself 3 years ago. This isn't your home, he continued, his voice rising, unaware of how ridiculous he looked trying to intimidate a man who had survived harder times than he could imagine. I felt a dry, bitter laugh bubbling in my chest, but I swallowed it down, tasting the iron of my own patience wearing thin. He thought he had the upper hand because he was young and loud, while I was just a gray-haired relic in the corner to him. I glanced at Martha, and she gave me a nearly imperceptible nod, a signal that she was ready for whatever came next. We stood up in unison, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to make Silas flinch just slightly. I didn't shout back or argue. I just looked him dead in the eye with the calm of a man holding a royal flush. He smirked, thinking our silence was submission, completely oblivious to the legal document sitting in the safe just 10 feet away. He was celebrating his victory, but the game hadn't even started yet. We marched down the driveway to my beat-up sedan, the gravel crunching loudly under my loafers as if announcing our retreat to the entire neighborhood. Martha was clutching her favorite potted fern to her chest like it was the crown jewels, refusing to leave it behind in enemy territory. I tried to open the car door with a swift, dramatic motion to maintain my dignity, but the handle stuck, forcing me to yank it 3 times like an amateur burglar. Silas was watching from the living room window, arms crossed, looking like the king of a castle built on a foundation of sand. I finally got into the driver's seat and tried to slam the door, only to have the seatbelt catch in the latch, ruining my grand exit completely. I cursed under my breath, untangling the belt while trying to ignore the heat rising in my cheeks. As I finally started the engine, it coughed and sputtered for a solid 10 seconds, a traitorous machine, before finally roaring to life. I saw our daughter, Lorna, standing in the shadows of the hallway behind Silas, looking down at her feet rather than meeting my gaze. That sight hurt more than Silas's words. Silence is an incredibly heavy thing to carry when it comes from the child you raised. "Where are we going, Orson?" Martha asked softly, adjusting the fern so it wouldn't block the side mirror. I didn't answer immediately because I was busy fighting with the turn signal that always sticks when I'm angry. "We're going to get pancakes," I finally grumbled, pushing my glasses up my nose where they had slipped from the sweat. We weren't running away to hide. We were regrouping, like old generals studying a map before the real cannon fire starts. I reached into my inside coat pocket and patted the thick envelope there, just to make sure the weapon that would destroy his arrogance was still safe. We sat in the corner booth of Rusty's Skillet, a place that smelled of bacon grease and desperate decisions, trying to look like we belonged there. I tried to read the laminated menu, but the grease spots made the prices look like blurry hieroglyphics, so I just squinted and pretended to ponder the difference between 2 identical egg breakfasts. Martha placed her fern on the table next to the sticky salt shaker, staring at its leaves as if waiting for the plant to offer us legal advice. "He changed the locks last week, Orson," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry autumn leaves under a heavy boot. I froze, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth, a piece of sausage dangling precariously before dropping right onto my clean shirt. Of course, the jammed front door key hadn't been my arthritis or a rusty cylinder. It was the first silent move in his little coup. I wiped the grease off my shirt with a napkin that was thinner than single-ply toilet paper, naturally smearing the stain into a larger, more artistic shape. The waitress, a woman named Brenda who looked like she'd seen it all twice, slammed 2 mugs down, splashing hot coffee onto my wrist. I didn't even flinch. The burn on my skin was nothing compared to the scorch in my chest. Silas had been planning this while eating my roast beef and drinking the wine I bought for special occasions. I looked at Martha, really looked at her, and saw the lines of worry deepening around her eyes. Eyes that used to sparkle when she talked about our grandchildren. We were eating lukewarm eggs in a roadside diner while a stranger in a cheap suit claimed ownership of 40 years of our sweat and sacrifice. It wasn't just theft, it was an erasure of our existence, executed with a smile. I took a sip of the coffee, which tasted like battery acid and regret, and patted my pocket, realizing my wallet was still sitting on the hallway table back at the house. I was about to tell Martha about the wallet when my phone buzzed violently against the table surface. A notification flashed on the screen, a security alert for a massive withdrawal attempt at our joint account. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button like I was disarming a nuclear bomb, but my dry fingertips simply wouldn't register on the glass. I tapped it once, twice, then aggressively jabbed it until the phone slipped from my grip, skittering across the greasy linoleum and under the neighboring booth. A teenager with neon purple hair picked it up and handed it back with a look of profound pity that made me feel ancient. "Thank you," I grunted, finally managing to block the transaction, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to break its cage. Silas wasn't just kicking us out. He was trying to sever our lifelines before we could even mount a defense. I looked at Martha, who was now meticulously shredding a sugar packet into a pile of white dust, her way of managing terror without screaming. "You saw me type the PIN last week at the grocery store," she whispered, her voice trembling. I closed my eyes, biting back the urge to lecture her about security, suddenly remembering I had left my own reading glasses on the dashboard of his truck a month ago. I dialed the bank, forced to listen to a cheerful robot tell me my call was important while smooth jazz played, the absolute soundtrack of my nightmare. I wanted to smash the device against the wall, but I hesitated, remembering it was on a payment plan I hadn't finished paying off yet. The anger shifted then, turning from hot rage into a cold, heavy stone in my gut. He knew exactly where we were vulnerable because we had shown him. He didn't just want the house. He wanted to erase our independence, to turn us into confused old burdens he could manage. Just as the jazz music stopped and a human voice finally answered, a text message banner dropped down from the top of the screen. "Lorna is crying because of you." I hung up the phone without speaking. "Lorna is crying because of you." That sentence hit me harder than a physical blow, sitting there on the screen like a toxic accusation. I tried to type a furious reply, demanding to speak to my daughter immediately, but my thick, trembling fingers kept hitting the period key instead of the space bar, making me look like an illiterate moron. "Let up me talk daughter." I erased it 3 times, cursing modern technology, and accidentally took a screenshot of my own failure, the phone flashing white in my face like a paparazzi camera. The waitress dropped the check on the table, $14.50 for misery and burnt coffee, and walked away without looking at us. I stared at the paper, the humiliation rising in my throat like bile, because I knew my wallet was sitting on the hallway table next to Silas's keys. I had to lean across the table, avoiding eye contact with the other patrons, and whisper to my wife, "I can't pay," feeling less like a protector and more like a dependent child. Martha didn't blink. She simply opened her purse, bypassing the tissues and the strawberry hard candies she's carried since 1998, and pulled out a wad of crumpled 1s and 5s she stashed for rainy days. We counted the bills out on the sticky table, smoothing them down one by one while the teenager with purple hair watched us from the next booth with open curiosity. It was a small, quiet degradation, paying for breakfast with wrinkled singles like we were scraping the bottom of the barrel just to survive. We walked out of the diner, the sun glaring far too brightly for the darkness we felt, and I saw a text notification pop up from our neighbor, Bob. I expected sympathy, perhaps an offer of a guest room or a hot meal, so I opened it with a desperate spark of hope. "Did you guys hire a junk removal service? There's a truck dumping your vintage bedroom set on the front lawn right now." I nearly dropped the phone again, my heart stuttering in a rhythm that would definitely concern my cardiologist if I hadn't missed my appointment last week to fix the deck. "He's dumping the bedroom set," I croaked to Martha, my voice sounding less like a roar of vengeance and more like a rusty hinge. We scrambled into the car, and in my haste to be an action hero, I jammed the key into the ignition upside down, scratching the plastic for 5 agonizing seconds before realizing my mistake. I reversed out of the parking spot with the grace of a startled buffalo, narrowly missing a shopping cart that seemed to appear out of thin air just to mock me. As we sped down Elm Street, doing 35 in a 30 zone because I was feeling dangerous, I felt a crushing weight settle in my chest that had nothing to do with my cholesterol. That bedroom set wasn't just wood. It was the first thing we bought as a married couple, paid off in installments back when we were eating ramen and dreaming of this very house. Martha was gripping the dashboard with white knuckles, the fern now wedged dangerously between her feet and the glove box, spilling dirt onto the floor mats. "My vanity table," she whispered, a tear finally escaping, and that single drop of water enraged me more than Silas's shouting ever could. We turned the corner onto our street, and there it was, a chaotic pile of mahogany and memories sprawled across the green grass I had just fertilized yesterday. A stranger in a blue jumpsuit was casually tossing my bedside drawer, the one with the sticky track I'd been meaning to fix for 20 years, onto the heap like it was contaminated waste. I slammed on the brakes too hard, throwing us both forward against the seatbelts, the car groaning in protest as we jerked to a halt. I tried to unbuckle quickly to storm out, but my thumb slipped on the release button, trapping me in the seat for an extra, humiliating moment while the workman stared at me. I finally burst out of the car, shouting something unintelligible, my knees popping loudly enough to be heard over the neighborhood traffic. I marched toward the pile, ready to physically drag the furniture back inside, but I froze mid-step when I saw who was standing next to Silas on the porch. It wasn't Lorna, and it wasn't a mover. It was Officer Miller, a man I had fished with for 10 years, holding his hand near his holster. "Jim," I said, nodding at Officer Miller, trying to keep my voice steady, though my lungs were whistling like a broken kettle from the short run up the driveway. Miller wouldn't meet my eyes. He focused intensely on the brass buttons of his uniform, looking like a schoolboy caught cheating on a math test. "I'm sorry, Orson," he muttered, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Silas showed us the deed transfer and the restraining order." Restraining order? The words hit me so hard, I actually took a step back, my heel catching on a rogue garden gnome I'd hated for years, nearly sending me sprawling at Silas's feet. I flailed my arms like a drowning man, barely regaining my balance, while Silas let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. "You're trespassing," my son-in-law said, smoothing his tie, looking down at me with the pity one saves for a senile dog. I opened my mouth to scream about the trust fund, the forgery, the truth, but all that came out was a dry, pathetic wheeze. My blood pressure was roaring in my ears, drowning out the neighborhood birds, and I realized with terrifying clarity that if I stayed, I would have a stroke right here on the lawn. That would be his ultimate victory, me drooling in a hospital bed while he redecorated my den with modern art. I looked at the house, my house, observing the peeling paint on the shutters I was supposed to scrape this weekend, and it felt like saying goodbye to a limb. I turned around slowly, stiffly, preserving what little dignity I had left, refusing to limp even though my sciatica was screaming in protest. "This isn't over," I whispered, but the wind carried the words away before they reached the porch, making me feel incredibly small. I walked back to the car where Martha was waiting, her face pressed against the glass, and I realized my hands were too numb to feel the steering wheel. I put the car in drive, thinking we were completely defeated, but I failed to notice what Martha was staring at. She wasn't looking at the furniture on the lawn. She was locked on the upstairs window, where a shadow had just moved.
I didn't tell Orson what I saw because his face was already the color of a ripe tomato, and I was genuinely afraid he'd drive us into a fire hydrant if I startled him. Up in the guest room window, the one I had just hung floral curtains in 2 months ago, Lorna was pressing her hand against the glass. She wasn't looking at us with anger. She looked like a prisoner sending a silent SOS, her mouth moving in a word I couldn't read because my distance vision has been garbage since 1995. I clutched my fern tighter, getting potting soil all over my good beige slacks, the ones I only wear for church and bingo. Orson was muttering curses at a stop sign that had clearly offended him personally, unaware that I was fighting a silent war against tears in the passenger seat. We were homeless, practically penniless, and my husband was driving like he was in a low-speed chase on the evening news. I reached into my purse for a tissue but pulled out a half-melted chocolate bar instead, getting sticky fudge on my thumb, perfect, just perfect. I licked it off quickly, hoping Orson wouldn't judge me for stress eating in a crisis, but the sugar didn't sweeten the bitterness in my throat. I looked back at the house as it shrank in the side mirror, feeling a physical rip in my chest, like a seam popping on a tight dress. That wasn't just wood and brick. It was where I taught Lorna to walk, where I bandaged knees, where I hid the Christmas presents in the attic. Now, a man who thinks cleaning means kicking things under the rug was treating it like his personal kingdom. I wasn't just sad, I was furious in a way only a mother can be when she realizes her child is being held hostage by their own bad choices. Orson finally merged onto the highway, cutting off a minivan and earning us a symphony of honks. "I know where we're going," he announced, though he looked as lost as a sock in a dryer. I glanced down at my phone, which I had silenced for the drive, and saw a notification from the home security app that Silas hadn't revoked access to yet. The camera in the hallway was live, and it was recording a conversation he never intended for us to hear. I tried to bring the phone closer to my ear to hear better, but in my panic, I fumbled and hit the Bluetooth button, blasting Silas's voice through the car speakers at a volume usually reserved for teenage rappers. Orson jumped so violently he swerved into the breakdown lane, running over a traffic cone that made a loud, pathetic thump under the chassis. "Yeah, the old fools are gone," Silas's voice boomed, filling our beat-up sedan with his arrogance while Orson wrestled the steering wheel back to center. On the tiny screen, I watched our son-in-law kick my favorite decorative basket out of his way, the one I'd spent 3 weeks weaving in my craft class. "Bring the cash buyer at noon," he said into his headset. "I want the deed transferred today before Lorna asks too many questions." I gasped, inhaling a piece of gum I shouldn't have been chewing, and spent the next 10 seconds hacking and coughing while Orson stared at the radio in horror. "He's selling it today?" Orson shouted, missing the exit we needed and forced to drive toward the industrial district instead. Silas continued. "I told Lorna they agreed to move to assisted living. She thinks she's doing them a favor by letting them go." I finally managed to hit the mute button, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone into my oversized purse, which is basically a black hole for lost electronics. He wasn't just stealing the house. He was rewriting our reality, painting us as incompetent to cover his greed. I looked at Orson, expecting him to be broken, but the confusion on his face was hardening into cold, sharp steel. We weren't senile, and we certainly weren't going to assisted living without a fight that would make the evening news. I noticed the timestamp on the video feed was lagging by 20 minutes due to the bad connection. That meant the noon meeting Silas mentioned wasn't happening in the future, it was starting right now. Orson pulled a U-turn that was illegal in at least 3 counties, bumping over a median strip and sending my purse sliding into the dark abyss of the backseat floor. "I know a shortcut," he shouted over the GPS lady, who was calmly insisting we make a legal U-turn at the next light. I gripped the "Oh Lord" handle above the door, praying to saints I hadn't thought about since 3rd grade, as we rattled down a back alley filled with dumpsters. The thought of strangers walking through my kitchen right this second, opening my cupboards and judging my collection of mismatched mugs, made my stomach twist in knots. "Turn left," I screamed, realizing too late that he was already turning, nearly taking out a decorative mailbox shaped like a manatee. We were 2 retirees in a dented sedan acting like action heroes, fueled by indignation and the terrible diner coffee sloshing in our stomachs. It was absolutely ridiculous, dangerous, and somehow the most alive I had felt in a decade. We screeched back onto our street, the engine whining in protest, just as a sleek black luxury car was backing out of our driveway. Silas was standing on the porch, smiling that oily smile of his, shaking hands with a man who looked like he cost more than our entire retirement fund. Orson didn't even park the car properly. He just abandoned it in the middle of the road, the door chime dinging incessantly like a panic alarm. I scrambled to get out, but my seat felt locked tight, yanking me back against the seat like a paddleball on a string. By the time I finally wrestled myself free and stumbled onto the pavement, Orson was already charging up the lawn, waving the thick envelope he had been guarding all morning. He didn't yell or scream this time. He simply walked right past Silas and slammed his hand onto the hood of the buyer's expensive car. The buyer rolled down the window, looking annoyed, but his expression changed instantly when Orson held the document up to the glass. I finally hobbled up the driveway, waving my purse like a medieval mace, just in time to hear Silas hiss, "Dad, stop embarrassing yourself, you're senile." Orson didn't budge. He stood there with his hand on that glossy hood, looking like a stubborn old tree root that refused to be dug up. The buyer, a young man with a haircut that cost more than our first car, looked from the paper to Silas with growing alarm. "This deed is in a living trust," the buyer said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. "It says the transfer requires 4 signatures, not 1. Silas froze, his mouth opening and closing like a goldfish dropped on the carpet, realizing his quick sale just hit a concrete wall. I saw the color drain from his face, leaving him looking like unbaked dough. "It's a mistake, just a clerical error." Silas stammered, reaching for the paper, but Orson slapped his hand away with a speed I hadn't seen since he swatted mosquitoes in '89. I stood beside my husband, trying to look menacing, but I had to lean on the mailbox because my bad knee was throbbing in time with my heartbeat. "The only error," I said, catching my breath and adjusting my cardigan to hide the sweat stains, "is you thinking we were dead already." The buyer handed the paper back to Orson as if it were radioactive, shaking his head with disgust. "I don't do disputed titles, man," he told Silas, backing away toward the driver's seat while I mentally cheered. Silas looked at us, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom, the mask of the concerned son-in-law completely gone now. He stepped off the porch, marching toward us with clenched fists, and for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't sure if Orson could handle him physically. Suddenly, the front door behind Silas flew open with a crash that made us all jump. Lorna stood in the frame, her face streaked with tears, holding a suitcase in one hand and something much more dangerous in the other. Lorna stood on the threshold, clutching the heavy iron fire poker from the living room, her knuckles white as bone against the dark metal. Silas stopped dead, his eyes darting from the rusted weapon to her tear-streaked face, clearly calculating if he could tackle her before she swung. "I called the police 5 minutes ago," she screamed, her voice breaking, "and I told them everything about the offshore accounts." Orson tried to rush to her aid, but tripped over his own shoelaces, which he refuses to double knot because it takes too much time, and stumbled sideways into the recycling bin with a clamor of glass bottles that sounded like a bar fight in a library. It was a pathetic, chaotic moment, yet seeing my husband try to charge into battle with bad knees made my chest ache with a fierce, terrifying love. Silas didn't care about the police anymore. He lunged at Lorna like a cornered animal, knocking the poker from her hand with a sickening clatter that echoed down the street. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her violently, shouting about how she had ruined his life, and I saw the absolute terror in my daughter's eyes that no mother should ever witness. Orson was struggling to get up from the pile of bottles, cursing his hip, flailing like a turtle on its back, and completely helpless to reach them in time. I was the only one standing, the only one left between this monster and the people I loved most in the world. I didn't think, I didn't plan, and I certainly didn't worry about my arthritis or my dignity. I gripped the handles of my heavy purse, loaded with 3 rolls of quarters, a brick-sized power bank, and a frozen water bottle, and swung it with every ounce of rage I had suppressed for 40 years. The leather strap groaned under the tension as the bag flew through the air in a perfect, heavy arc aimed right at his head. Silas turned just in time to see the impact coming, but it was too late to dodge. The bag connected with the side of his head with a solid, satisfying thud, like a melon dropped from a roof. Silas crumbled sideways, his legs tangling in the garden hose, and he went down hard, taking a terracotta pot with him. The impact caused my purse to burst open, showering the driveway with quarters, throat lozenges, and, to my absolute horror, my spare set of dentures, which clattered across the pavement like chattering teeth. I spun around from the momentum and sat down abruptly in the mulch, losing one shoe in the process. Bullseye. Orson cheered from the recycling bin, still unable to get up, a banana peel draped unceremoniously over his shoulder. Lorna didn't wait. She scrambled over the porch railing and threw herself into my arms, sobbing into my wool cardigan like she was 5 years old again. Silas tried to stand, shaking his head, but his expensive Italian loafer slipped on the rolling quarters, sending him back down to his knees in a humiliating bow. It was slapstick comedy, but the fear in my veins turned it into tragedy. Officer Miller, who had clearly seen enough, stepped onto the lawn, his hand resting casually on his belt. Silas pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming about assault, but he looked ridiculous surrounded by my spilled peppermint candies. "She's armed and dangerous," Miller drawled dryly, looking at my empty purse. "Looks like she's out of ammo, though." The sirens I had prayed for finally wailed down the street, filling the air with a chaotic, beautiful noise. Silas stopped shouting, his eyes darting between the police car and the house, realizing his time was up. As the officers approached him with handcuffs, Silas looked at me one last time, not with anger, but with the cold, hollow realization that he had underestimated the strength of old fools. The police cruiser disappeared around the corner, taking the noise and the man who tried to erase us, leaving only a stunned silence in its wake. Lorna and I finally hoisted Orson out of the recycling bin, peeling a sticky candy wrapper off his elbow while he insisted he could have jumped out if he really wanted to. "I was just waiting tactically," he grumbled, dusting off his pants while trying to hide the fact that his glasses were hanging precariously from one ear. I retrieved my dentures from under the hydrangea bush, rinsing them off with the garden hose before popping them back in. Dignity is a luxury we simply couldn't afford today. We walked up the porch steps together, the three of us, my bad knee protesting every inch of the way, but my spirit feeling lighter than air. Lorna unlocked the front door, her hand shaking violently, and pushed it open to reveal the quiet, dusty hallway that Silas had tried to claim as his own. It smelled of stale air and betrayal, but underneath, I could still smell the lavender polish I've used on the banister for 30 years. We sat on the floor of the living room because the chairs were still scattered on the lawn, leaning against each other like weary soldiers after a long siege. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Lorna whispered, burying her face in my shoulder, and I simply stroked her hair, knowing that words weren't necessary anymore. Orson looked around the empty room, then at me, and a slow, crooked smile spread across his face, the kind that made me fall in love with him in 1975. "Well," he said, rubbing his sore hip with a grimace, "at least the idiot didn't figure out how to disconnect the coffee maker." We laughed then, a tired, broken sound that slowly turned into real, healing laughter that filled the empty corners of the room. We aren't young, and we certainly aren't fast, but like the oak tree in the backyard, our roots go too deep to be torn out by a passing storm. This house is ours again, not because we were given it, but because when the world told us to leave, we simply planted our feet and stayed.